The battlefield floated in endless night, a graveyard of lightless ships and drifting steel. The airless silence carried the memory of voices that once shouted orders across the comlinks, but now only echoes remained. Captain Rhea Vale stood at the viewing pane of her small corvette, the Starborn, her eyes tracing the broken ribs of a coalition cruiser spinning without power, its hull torn by beams that had burned through armor as if it were paper. She had seen wars before, but never something that erased whole fleets without leaving even a flare of defiance. Beside her moved Jax, the ship's engineer. His hands still stained with the soot of repairs, he whispered that the distress beacons were fading one by one, and that soon the entire sector would go dark behind them. The younger crew members watched in silence, every face pale under the dim bridge lights. Rhea ordered the sensors to full range and waited as faint readings flickered across the glass until one pulse refused to die. It came from a courier pod smaller than a fighter and still sending its cry. She felt a tug inside her chest, the kind she never ignored. Saren, the alien messenger inside that pod, was barely alive, wrapped in a cracked survival field. She was from a world of song and crystal towers, and now her voice came through static like wind through ruins. She spoke of something called the Pale Crown, and of a weapon that could swallow suns. She said her people tried to fight, and every allied fleet joined them until the stars themselves seemed to turn away. Rhea listened while guiding her ship closer. She told Jax to warm the docking clamps and hold the engines cold to hide their heat signature. She had no orders from Earth Command, and no one left to report, to only instinct that told her if even one survivor still breathed, they were worth the risk. The pod locked with a shudder, and the crew pulled Saren aboard. Her body was translucent like living glass, and her eyes held the shimmer of deep oceans. She gasped at the sight of humans, rough-suited, scarred, tired, and yet moving with purpose. Rhea gave her water, sealed her fractures with gel, and asked what message she carried. Saren lifted a hand, trembling, and revealed a shard of crystal glowing faintly. She said it was proof the Pale Crown was building a chain of star killers to feed on living suns and turn light into command power. Before Rhea could answer, sensors picked another signal, faint but rhythmic. It was a coalition, frequency 1, reserved for high command. She magnified it and found it came from the ruins of a dreadnought, half melted and rolling through debris. Inside might still be someone alive. Jax muttered that it could be a trap. Rhea said that if it was, she would rather meet it than hide from it. She guided the Starborn into the wreck field, engines pulsing, low shields brushing fragments that sparked and vanished. Saren watched and whispered that no other species would dare move through a graveyard like this for a stranger. Rhea smiled without humor and said, "Humans have a problem with letting go. They found the signal in a chamber filled with drifting bodies and shattered consoles. There lay a small cryo cradle, still glowing faint blue inside. Was a child with faintly luminous veins, the genetic markings of a coalition command line. The name tag read, Alien Rhea. Carried the cradle back herself. The weight small but heavy in meaning. Saren stared at it and said that the child carried the key codes for thousands of refugee arcs. If the Pale Crown found him, they would enslave every world that tried to flee Rhea. Ordered full burn away from the wreck's engines, roaring alive as the Starborn turned from the debris field like a spark, fleeing ash on the outer sensors. Dark signatures began to move, hunters shaped like blades folding through vacuum. Following the warmth of the human ship, Rhea knew they had been marked. She strapped in and told Jax to make the engines scream, because sometimes the only way to live was to be louder than fear. Saren pressed a hand to the glass and saw for the first time what humans looked like when cornered. They were not afraid, they were alive. In the purest sense, her world had told stories that humans came from a death world, that they were too wild to join the stars. But in that moment, as the Starborn leapt into the dark, dragging light in its wake, she saw the truth. They were the kind of wild that runs toward the fire, not away from it. And that kind of wild might be the only thing left strong enough to save the galaxy. The Starborn ran on a thin edge of heat as Rhea drove it out of the graveyard and into a lane of dark slip, where the engines hummed like a low song that eased the strain on the hull and the hearts of the crew. She told Jax to keep the burn steady, and she told Mara to open a narrow channel for Haven Spire, because Haven was the only place where human codes still meant shelter, and because the child Elian needed a circle of safety larger than one ship. Saren sat near the cryo cradle and watched the tiny breaths fog the lid. and her hands shook with a mix of grief and wonder. She had seen her fleets broken and her cities dim, but she had not seen a child who carried the roots of thousands of souls, and she thought that maybe this was why the Pale Crown always feared small lights. They are hard to stamp out once they start to spread. Haven Spire rose from a black gulf like a tower of anchored ships bound together by bridges and gardens and old promises. The approach lanes were crowded with traders and broken refugees and scavengers who had forgotten shame, but remembered hunger. Rhea sent the old phrase that unlocked a path for those who swore shelter and a beacon lit to guide them to a berth the spire had been built by many hands, and it looked like it every surface scarred, every corridor patched with the work of someone who refused to leave the stars. Rhea carried the cradle, while Mara flanked her and Jack stayed with the ship to make sure no curious fingers found their way into the engines. Saren followed, close her eyes wide, at the sight of humans living in the open market. Decks were full of sound and scent and bright, cloth and tools and music, and it felt like a city that had decided to breathe louder than fear. They reached a clinic where the old human doctor took one look at the cradle and nodded. Once, talking only to move tasks forward, he said the child was stable. He said the glow in the veins was a harmless mark and not a sickness. He said the room would be guarded because the spire still remembered the meaning of oath. Rhea thanked him and asked for a quiet hall to speak with allies. The doctor smiled, with tired kindness, and pointed them to a small chamber where the walls were lined with old star maps and hand-drawn notes. Mara called in a few captains who owed favors, and they came quickly because Rhea did not deal in lies. Saren told the story of the gloaming circuit, the chain that would drain 5 suns to power a Dominion signal that could bend weaker minds. She placed her crystal shard on the table, and the light inside it pulsed in time with distant forges. She spoke of workers chained to dark engines and of worlds told to kneel and live or stand and be dark forever. The room went still, and then it filled with the quiet anger of people who fix things for a living and hate to see something built for harm. Rhea asked for routes to a small relay that fed the larger chain, a relay rumored to be hidden in the shadow of a dim dwarf star. Jack sent his models to the display and showed a path that could work if luck and courage stayed close. Mara wanted to leak the plan to the spire so that broken worlds would hear that someone had chosen to fight. Jack said that noise would bring slaughter, and that a quiet knife did more good than a proud shout. Rhea listened to both and kept her face calm. The choice was heavy, and no one could carry it for her. She looked at Elian sleeping under soft light, and she looked at Saren, who had already lost so much, and still stood straight. She said they would take a middle path. She said they would speak a plain truth to a few trusted voices who could spread hope without sending crowds to die. She said they would strike the relay first to prove the circuit could bleed. She said if they failed, they would at least fail in a way that taught others how to try again. Saren felt a weight lift, because this was the kind of speech that made you believe a person before you believed a plan. They were not alone in the room. A breeze brushed Rhea's wrist, and Saren felt cold, where there should be the warmth of many bodies. She lifted her head and saw dust move in a line that did not match the airflow, and she whispered that something was wrong. Rhea signaled silence, and the lights dimmed to battle low. From a vent slid a small shape like a spider of shadow. The assassin drone carried a thread-thin blade that could cut thought before sound. Mara moved first with a sweep of a coat that tore the thread. Jax burst through the door with a field wrench and slammed the drone into the wall, where it sparked with a hungry hiss. The room filled with the smell of burned metal, and the drone died with a soft chime that sounded like a sigh. Rhea stared at the pieces and knew the pale crown had followed the warmth of their hope into the heart of Haven. She opened her personal channel to the spire wardens and asked for a lockdown on the clinic. She asked for a ring of watchers from the old code families who still held to shelter like a prayer. Then she went to the public deck and stepped onto a crate and spoke in a voice that carried across the market. She said there was a child here who held keys for the lost. She said the spire had promised shelter and that the promise would be kept. She said, any who wish to help should keep eyes open, hands ready, and fear quiet. Saren listened and felt her chest crack open because she had seen speeches used like whips and knives, and here she saw one used like a lamp. Night came in the way of space stations, which is to say the lights dimmed and people rested, and the stars outside kept their own time. Rhea stood watch by the clinic window with a cup of strong tea that tasted like earth and rain. Mara sent messages to quiet friends and got back short answers filled with weight. Jax tuned the Starborn to sing with the docking cradle, so that if anyone tried to pry her free, the ship would wake with a shout. Saren sat beside the child and told him soft stories, in her language about rivers and sky bridges and a mother who hid songs inside shells to keep them safe. At false dawn, which is the time when the station prepares to brighten but has not yet done so, Rhea called the team to the dock. She said it was time to leave because the longer they stayed, the more hunters would gather. She gave Mara a stack of simple phrases to send through trusted channels, phrases that carried news without giving maps. She gave Jax the final checks and asked him if the ship could take a hit. He grinned without joy and said the Starborn could take 2, and then he would make a 3rd into a memory. Rhea turned to Saren and asked if she was ready to stand in the fire a little longer. Saren said she had already burned, and that now she wanted to burn for something that mattered. They lifted from Haven with quiet engines, and the spire saluted with a single line of light that climbed the hull like a blessing. Rhea set a course for the dim dwarf star, and for the relay that beat like a rotten heart inside a shadow. She knew they would be followed, but she also knew that being chased is not the same as being caught. The child slept. The crew breathed. The ship sang. The path ahead narrowed into a line as thin as a blade and as straight as a promise. And the Starborn moved along it with the kind of calm that grows only in people who have chosen their fear and found it smaller than their duty. The dwarf star glowed like an ember at the edge of creation, its light weak but stubborn, and it painted the hull of the Starborn in red fire as the corvette drifted into position behind a ring of silent asteroids. Rhea stood at the command deck, her hands resting on the console, her eyes fixed on the rotating debris field that hid the relay. She had learned long ago that fear before battle feels like cold in the bones, but once the engines start to hum, it becomes focus. Jax floated near the reactor bay, whispering to the machine as if it could hear him, while Mara checked the transmission dampers and Saren calibrated the shard crystal to read the relay's pulse pattern. In the cargo bay, Elian slept under a soft field of light, unaware that his heartbeat had become the rhythm of their hope. The plan was simple because complexity dies fast under fire. Rhea would slip the Starborn between the asteroids to the blind side of the relay. Jax would tether magnetic charges to the outer plates, and Saren would use the shard to trigger the relay's own overload sequence. They had one chance and a window no wider than a minute. If they succeeded, the Pale Crown's chain would lose a link, and the myth of their invincibility would fracture, even if only a little. Rhea looked at Saren and saw the same tension she used to see in soldiers before a drop. Not fear exactly, but the knowledge that life and death now shared a single heartbeat. She told her crew that the trick was not bravery, it was attention, every second a thread that must not break. When the Starborn broke from cover, the relay filled the screens, a metal spine, twisting around the dwarf star, drinking its energy like a parasite. Rhea guided the ship along the shadowed curve of the ring, their hull close enough for asteroids to scrape sparks. The sound carried through the metal and into their bones. Jax released the drones that crawled across the relay's surface, placing the charges one by one, while Saren whispered numbers that matched the relay's oscillation pattern. Rhea counted the seconds in her mind, the steady beat of duty holding the chaos at bay. Then the sensors flared as enemy scouts appeared, sliding through the dust, their engines dim. Their weapons hot. Mara called the first contact, and Rhea shifted to evasive drift. The ship rolled into the shade of a larger rock and hid its glow. The scouts passed close enough that the static of their radar brushed the hull. Saren's fingers trembled, but she kept her voice steady. She told Jax to link the final charge. She told Rhea that the timing was perfect. She pressed her hand to the shard and light poured through her veins. The relay responded like an animal sensing pain. Its hum deepened. The plates vibrated. The dwarf star flared brighter, and Rhea shouted for full burn. They fled as the relay tore itself apart, light bursting outward in silent fury. The explosion chased them through the dust field, and the Starborn rode the wave until the stars returned to quiet. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Jax laughed, the kind of laugh that comes when breath returns after being stolen. Rhea allowed herself a small smile because they had done it, a human ship, a handful of allies against a machine built to kill, and still they stood. The shard in Saren's hand glowed brighter, showing patterns across its surface, symbols she could not read shifting into shapes of coordinates. Mara leaned over her shoulder and said, "These are not words. They are locations of something waiting," and Saren realized the relay had been storing more than energy. It had been a map of sleeper allied stations, forgotten people who had once resisted the Pale Crown and were forced into hiding. The shard had awakened them. The celebration did not last long. A signal sliced through the silence, a coded transmission in the voice of the Pale Crown itself. The Ghost Admiral speaking with calm cruelty. He said the humans had made the galaxy remember pain, and that he would answer with precision. He said that every move Rhea made was now part of his study, because he had learned that humans win not by strength but by defiance, and he wanted to know how defiance felt before he erased it. Rhea cut the signal, but the crew knew it was no bluff they had drawn, the gaze of something that hunted not with hunger but with cold curiosity. They set course for a safe arc near a binary system to repair the hull and rest. But rest did not come. Jax discovered a fragment of the relay lodged in the Starborn side, a shard that pulsed faintly with the same rhythm as Saren's crystal when he tried to remove it. The pulse moved up his arm like static. He yanked his hand back and swore under his breath. Saren touched the fragment and felt it resonate with her. Own shard like a heartbeat answering across distance. She realized she was linked to the enemy forges through the same thread that gave her vision of their weakness. It was both gift and curse because she could now sense their movement, but also knew they could sense her. Rhea saw the look on Saren's face and understood without words. She told her that the price of knowing the path is often walking it barefoot. Saren nodded and said she was ready, but inside she feared what the connection might cost her. Jax sealed the fragment under containment and said he would find a way to study it safely. Mara said they needed to move faster, because now they had woken something much larger than a single admiral. When they dropped from the binary drift, they received scattered transmissions from old beacons. The coordinates Saren's shard had revealed began to match real voices. A clan of miners who lived inside hollow asteroids. A group of synthetics who sang through radio bands, and a remnant of a fleet that had sworn to repay any species that stood for freedom. Their words were halting but alive. They said they had felt the shock of the relay's death like a wind in vacuum, and had known that someone out there was still fighting. Rhea told them to stay hidden but ready, because the storm was only beginning. As the Starborn moved on toward the next shadow of the Pale Crown, the crew began to understand that they were no longer running. They were leading, even if they had not chosen. Saren stood by the viewport and watched the stars slide by. She thought about her lost world and about the humans who had turned wrecks into ships again. She thought that maybe the galaxy was not ending but beginning its second breath, and in that breath the name of humanity would no longer be whispered with fear, but with the strange quiet awe reserved for those who keep showing up after everyone else has fallen. Pelagos rose before them like a pearl set in black velvet. A water moon, lit by slow bands of aurora and circled by rings of shattered ice that glittered like a necklace of winter. The Starborn slid into the shadow of those rings and coasted above violet seas that breathed mist into space. Rhea guided the corvette toward a cluster of domes perched on limestone cliffs where lanterns burned with soft blue fire and wind harps sang across the ridges. Here lived the tidal monks who kept libraries carved in salt rock and who believed that memory must move like water, or it turns heavy and cruel. Saren stood at the viewport and felt a hush inside because her people once shaped temples from glass reefs, and this place woke echoes of that lost music. Elian slept in the med cradle and dreamed without fear, the glow in his veins steady as a night lamp, and the crew gave him quiet as if their own strength depended on the rest of one small heart. A skiff rose from the cliff harbor to meet them, its engine a low purr like a cat at a hearth. A monk with tide beads on his wrist signaled welcome and asked them to follow a path between chiming buoys. Rhea kept the channel open and spoke with plain respect. She requested shelter and knowledge, and in return offered work hands against any harm that might follow. Them the monk nodded and said that Havenspire had already whispered of their oath, and that the sea listens when people mean their words. They docked at a stone pier where spray blew over them like cold silver. Place in the air smelled clean enough to make even Jax forget the taste of engine smoke. For a breath inside the main dome, the walls curved like the inside of a shell, Shelves carved into the curve held thousands of tied books, each one written on flexible sheets that rustled softly as the building's pumps kept a tidal rhythm. The abbot was a woman with hair the color of moonfrost and eyes that watched. Without turning hard, she offered tea brewed from salt flowers and listened as Rhea explained the relay strike and the pursuit that would surely come. Saren placed her shard on a stone table, and its inner light painted the ceiling with faint maps that flowed like currents. The abbot said the shard was singing to the room and that the room was answering because everything that holds memory wants to be touched by its own kind. They brought Elian to a small, quiet ward, and the monks traced protective script in chalk around his cradle. Not magic, but a promise written slow enough for the mind to breathe. The abbot then led Saren to a chamber open to the sea where narrow bridges crossed tidal pools. She spoke of the ritual of echo and said it could let Saren hear the last strong memories of those she had loved if Saren was willing to give a true question in return. Saren stepped onto a bridge that swayed with the pulse of the pools and asked how she could carry so many hopes without breaking the water, answered with a soft lifting of spray, and within the hiss, she heard a voice like the one that sang her to sleep as a child. Her mother said that a vessel does not carry the ocean. It learns to move with the wave. And that is how a little boat can cross a vast night. Saren wept without sound, and the monks pretended not to notice because grief is a tide that needs room to rise and fall. While Saren met her echo, Rhea and Mara joined a council with free captains and traders who wintered on Pelagos. The room overlooked a long surf line, and the windows were open, so wind and salt could wash the talk clean of pretense. Mara mapped the gloaming circuit and showed how the hollow sun at its center harvested obedience from stolen light. Some captains argued that the pale crown could not be beaten, that a pull that drains suns cannot be opposed by ships that run on courage and patched cores. Rhea listened, and then told them what she had seen since the graveyard, the way people rise when even one ship keeps a promise. She said that surrender is a plan, without a future, and that small victories change the shape of the next hour. She did not ask them for belief. She asked them for an hour of their time. And the room grew quieter because the price had become human again. The first warning of danger came as a shiver in the ring ice above the dome sensor. Glyphs pulsed amber and a monk runner announced a fleet fragment on approach. A pale-crowned spear group with black hulls and cold engines. They signaled amnesty for Pelagos if Elian was surrendered. Along with the human ship, Rhea walked to the open window and let the salt wind touch her face. Then she answered on an open channel and said that shelter meant shelter, and that the sea would remember anyone who broke it. She spoke without threat. Only weight, the kind of weight that makes people stand straighter. And the abbot smiled because she had heard that tone before in oaths written on wet stone. The battle that followed did not begin with trumpets. It began with water. The monks released, tied baffles into cliff channels that turned the surf into a moving wall, and the Starborn dropped into an ice canyon where the rings above cast pale light like a cathedral ceiling. Jacks synced the corvette to the canyon's curves, and the hull skated inches from frozen blades. Enemy skimmers knifed down the canyon, but the synthetics who had followed the Starborn from Haven sang through the comm bands, and their cord bent the guidance of hostile drones for a breath at a time. Saren stood at a side console with the shard pressed to her palm. She felt the pull of the circuit like a distant storm trying to claim the moon's small weather. She spoke to that pull and told it a lie that tasted true. For 1 minute the lie said the canyon was a void with nothing living inside, and the hostile targeting shuddered and slid past. Mara worked the decoy beacons as if painting with bright lines. She led 2 enemy craft into a curtain of falling ice that shattered across their intakes. Rhea used the gap to sprint for open sea where the Starborn could breathe free. The Ghost Admiral did not show his face, but his tactics marked his hand. Every trap had a second jaw. Every safe lane hit a hook twice. Rhea chose the narrow way that felt wrong to the eye, and twice it opened like a door. Because she had learned to trust the small math of her bones, the spear group circled to cut them off, and the abbot spoke a quiet order that opened the cliff pumps. The sea leapt sideways into a glassy wall, and the skimmers smashed their noses on the lift as if the moon had learned to punch. When the Starborn cleared the last ridge, the enemy flagship rose from the horizon like a blade. The channel opened, and a voice dry as old parchment spoke not to threaten but to measure. It said that the human captain had become a variable that broke models, and that variables like this must be isolated and solved. Rhea replied that she was not an equation. She was a door people used when they needed a way out. Then she closed the channel and told Jax to give her one burst that would taste like thunder. The Corvette kicked hard and climbed into the ring shadow where cutters could not track cleanly. Saren felt the shard flare and knew the forge pull was missing its mark. She held the lie one breath more and then let it go before it could turn and bite her. The fleet fragment began to withdraw, not because it feared damage, but because the Ghost Admiral had seen enough he wanted. Rhea to live long enough to teach him the pattern of human refusal, and that choice would cost him later. The Starborn returned to the cliff harbor on low power, and the monks lit lanterns along the path. The abbot greeted them with a bowl of warm broth for each crew member and an old sailor blessing that spoke of storms and of hands that do not release the rope until the others are aboard. Rhea felt the heat of the bowl and allowed herself a thin smile because Pelagos had stood without surrender and because the crew had found a way through a narrow throat without leaving anyone behind. In the quiet that followed, Saren sat by the tide pools and looked at the night the aurora wrote slow green letters across the sky, and she tried to read a promise in them. She thought of her mother's echo and of Rhea's voice carrying across the market at Haven, and of Elian sleeping in the ward like a seed that would one day root into something strong. She knew the Ghost Admiral had set a trap somewhere ahead, a place of wrecks and false paths, but she also knew that every hour they kept moving was another hour for sleepers to wake in. Far orbits, the shard warmed her hand, and she whispered a small vow that she would carry what hope she could for as long as she could, and when she could not, she would hand it to those stubborn humans who kept turning fire into shelter and fear into a road that led forward. The coalition fleet drifted above Pelagos for a week, gathering courage. More than fuel, the air of the moon carried a calm that worked on the heart. Rhea walked the upper decks of the Starborn each dawn, watching the light crawl over the ice rings. She knew that peace was the kind of silence that never lasted, but she let the quiet fill her lungs anyway. The crew moved like a family, Jax and Mara arguing about repair speeds, Saren recording stories from the monks, and Elian walking now small but alert with a child's careful wisdom. When he laughed, it echoed through the hull and made everyone remember why they were still trying to fight. The Council of Captains met inside the largest dome of Pelagos, where wind harps filled the background with slow music. They gathered around a projection of the gloaming circuit, and the hollow sun, the monstrous core of the pale crown. The map pulsed in red veins, showing the path of stolen energy. Rhea pointed to the outer relays, now dead because of their strike. Saren showed how the signal through the shard had shifted. Like a weakened pulse, the monk said that the moment to strike the heart would soon come, because the drain pattern was wobbling. Mara wanted to spread word to the broken worlds to gather everyone for one final uprising. She said it was time to shout instead of whisper. Jax argued that a broadcast would call death before victory, and that stealth could save lives. Rhea listened in silence. Her face a storm. She had learned that every war is lost, not by the wrong plan, but by forgetting what the plan was for. That night she stood on the cliff above the sea, the aurora moving above her like living fire. Saren joined her and said that hope and fear were the same water seen from different sides. Rhea nodded and said she was tired of watching galaxies die. She said she had decided that if they were going to die, they would die standing together, not scattered in silence. She told Saren that she would not choose between noise and stealth. She would choose both, a loud truth wrapped around a quiet knife they would strike, and they would make sure the galaxy saw it happen. Not because they wanted glory, but because belief was the weapon the Pale Crown could never forge. The plan spread through the coalition like a heartbeat. The miners, from the Belt of Thorns, prepared their heavy barges to act as shields. The synthetics from Haven tuned their harmonic weapons. The monks carried data seeds filled with maps of safe zones the free captains offered to draw enemy scouts away with. Fake signals. Even the quiet traders of Pelagos filled their holds with medical supplies and food. Every person had a task, and for the first time in a long time the stars seemed to hum with shared purpose. Elian learned to use a small console that projected navigation symbols, his small hands tracing routes older captains had forgotten. When they left Pelagos, the farewell was a song the monks sang on the pier. It was not a hymn to gods, but to endurance. Rhea stood at the helm as the ships formed into formation behind the Starborn. The coalition was small compared to the armadas of the Pale Crown, but each vessel carried hearts that no empire could measure. They slipped through the rings, and into the deep dark where the graveyard of ships waited. The Ghost Admiral's trap lay hidden there. Wrecks floating in deceptive peace jacks whispered that it was too quiet. Rhea agreed and ordered the fleet to spread thin to reduce the target cluster. Trap sprang as a ripple of false stars' mines shaped like drifting lanterns turned and revealed black cores, firing beams that tore the void open. Mara screamed coordinates and the fleet broke formation. Half a dozen small ships were lost before they even fired back. Rhea pushed the Starborn into the minefield engines, cutting close enough to melt paint. Jax burned half the coolant to keep shields alive. Saren linked to the shard and felt the presence of the Ghost Admiral, cold, curious like a scientist watching an experiment. He had planted his own fleet in the debris, pretending to be crippled. And now he rose from behind the wrecks with lines of silent cutters, their hulls reflecting no light. The battle that followed felt less like war and more like drowning sound vanished under the weight of static and motion. The coalition fired blind, guided only by the shard's pulses. Rhea read the chaos like a map of instinct. Her voice calm as she called every shift, every dive, every sacrifice. She told Mara to break the enemy's lock with false transmissions that made the human ships look like wreckage. She told Jax to vent plasma into the field, to make false suns for the sensors the miners used their barges to ram through. The cutter line buying the Starborn an opening. A single ship called the Dervish stayed behind its captain, laughing as he pushed his burning vessel into the enemy formation. He said into the comm, "Tell Haven we kept the oath," and then he was gone. The survivors regrouped outside the debris field. The losses were heavy, the silence in the comms heavier still. Rhea looked at the empty spaces on her display where friend codes had blinked out. She felt the ache behind her ribs, but she did not let it break her. She said to the remaining ships that this was proof the Pale Crown could bleed, because it had needed deceit and traps to win this small fight. She said the hollow sun would fall because too many ghosts were now flying beside them, and she believed it enough that others began to believe too. Jax came to the bridge with burn marks on his arms, but a grin on his face. He said the Starborn still had one charge left, and that if they used it right, it could break a forge coil. Saren stood beside him holding the shard. The light inside it changed color, deep gold like dawn. She said the forges were waking faster now and that they had little time. Rhea looked at Mara and said, "Set course for the hollow sun and open the channel wide. Let every free world, every broken colony hear us," she said. "Let them see we are not finished." Across the stars, old receivers came alive in dust-covered rooms and forgotten bunkers, voices long silent, hearing the signal of a human captain promising that the fight was not over. The Ghost Admiral listened too and smiled without joy. He told his crew to prepare because the lesson would now begin. The hollow sun waited ahead, a wound in space, swallowing light and time, and Rhea Vale swore to herself that she would walk into its mouth and make it choke on every star it had stolen. The hollow sun rose before them like a black wound, stitched with threads of red light, and the coalition fell silent as if the sight itself had taken the air from their lungs. The forge was not a star and not a machine, but a hunger shaped into an orbiting temple. Its rings turned against the current of space, and each ring sang a note that made the teeth ache. Rhea stood at the helm of the Starborn and felt the ship lean forward as if it wanted to end this chase as much as any living crew could want it. Jax reported the coils were stable, but near the edge of what a sane engineer would call safe. Mara opened the wide channel, and the voices of distant worlds whispered back with hope like wind through tall grass. Saren pressed the shard into her palm, and the light inside answered with a steady pulse that matched the cold rhythm of the forge. Elian took his place beside the small console built for his hands, and looked up at Rhea with a steady gaze that belonged on someone much older, and said he was ready to hold the door if she could get him to the lock. They crossed the boundary, where starlight bent and stretched into ribbons, and the hull began to hum low and deep like a giant drum struck far away. Rhea called the plays in a tone that kept bones from shaking. She told the miners to form a wall and ride the slow tide inward. She told the synthetics to begin the cord that would scramble enemy rangefinders. She told the free captains to break formation and move like water around rock, because the forge had taught the pale crown to track patterns and water has none. The ghost admiral arrived in a crescent of silent ships that flared only when they fired, and his voice came through the band like frost on glass. He welcomed Rhea to the place where light ends and said he hoped humans were as interesting up close as they were in legend. Rhea said nothing back. She let the Starborn answer by cutting into the gravity wakes and sliding under the first lattice of defense like a knife that understands ribs. The battle was not a storm. It was a tide with a mind. The forge sent waves of force that pressed the coalition down and then lifted them without warning, while towers on the rings spun and spat black lances that sliced through space like winter wind. The synthetics sang a counternote that made the lances shiver off target for a heartbeat, and the miners jettisoned slabs of armored rock that spun into shields big enough to hide cities. Rhea used each opening like a diver who knows where the current will turn next, and each time she reached a calm pocket, she pushed one ship after another through it as if threading beads on a moving string. Saren read the shard and called out hidden paths in a voice that never rose above calm. Jax took the heat curve higher and higher until the deck plates sweated and the coolant hissed like rain inside. The walls Mara painted false signatures across the dark to make the enemy believe the human heart was somewhere it was not. And all the while, Elian watched the pattern resolve in front of him and waited for the one moment that mattered. They reached the inner ring where a gate turned like a jaw, and behind the gate lay the core, the place where the gloaming circuit tied its stolen suns together. Jax whispered that he had a chain ready to shove into the core if they could open the lock for 9 breaths, not 8, not 10, because the timing would either collapse the lattice or weld it shut forever. Saren touched the shard to the console and the symbols rolled like a story being told in reverse, and Elian placed both hands on the screen and let the key markings in his blood speak to the gate. The forge felt the touch of a command line and tried to trick the child with better paths and warm promises. It showed him gardens and bright rivers and said he could go home if he simply opened a different door. Elian shook his head and said, "Home is a promise you grow, not a place you keep," and the gate shuddered and revealed a seam. Rhea counted the breaths, not out loud, but with the old rhythm soldiers learn when they march to keep. Fear out of the knees, 1, 2, 3, while cutters fell in behind them like wolves, and the Ghost Admiral matched her turns as if they shared a spine. On the 4th breath, the ring tried to close, and Mara threw the Starborn sideways with a vector hack that bent the local field like a sheet in wind. Jax jammed the chain into the seam, and the hull screamed with a sound that had no word for it. Saren felt the shard pull at her like a tide trying to take her bones out through her skin, and she refused by remembering her mother's voice telling her to carry the small ones first. The synthetics burned their voices down to a raw burr, holding the counternote while the miners locked their barges, nose to tail into a wall that took the lances, and did not move. The 5th breath tasted like iron and the 6th like old smoke. Rhea watched the Ghost Admiral line for a kill shot and let him believe it would land. Then she cut power for a half-second and fell through his aim, and the shot clawed. Empty night where the Starborn had been. Mara laughed once sharp and bright and said, "He is good," and Rhea said, "Yes, he is, and we are still here." The 7th breath was the longest, because the forge woke a second gate hidden under the first, and tried to close it with raw gravity. Jax tore the last safeties free and gave the reactor the freedom to sing louder than he ever had before. The lights blew across the board. But the Starborn did not stop moving. Saren saw a path that cut through 2 fields. That should have been solid, and she told Rhea to take it on faith. Rhea did, because faith is simply trust that has run enough miles to build callous, and the ship slid between those fields as if the universe itself sighed and made room for a stubborn traveler. Elian held steady tears on his face, not from fear but from the effort of saying no to beautiful lies. The 8th breath came, and with it the sense that the hull would either crack or learn a new way to be steel, and it chose the second. Because Jax had patched it with things he loved, and things patched with love do not break the same way twice. On the 9th breath, the chain bit the core, and the rings around the hollow sun began to slow. Not a lot and not forever, but enough for the math to change. Rhea felt the tide turn under her feet and knew they had reached the moment when a myth becomes something else. Not victory yet, but the end of a certain kind of fear. The Ghost Admiral spoke, again, and his voice was no longer cold, it was curious and almost gentle, and he said that he had seen humans run toward fire, but he had not understood that they also bring water and blankets and names for the lost, and that perhaps this was the part he could not model. Rhea told him that models cannot hold a hand, and then the Admiral did something she did not expect. He pulled his cutters back 2 ship lengths and let the Starborn clear the jaw because he wanted to see what would happen. To a forge when hope and anger pulled at it at the same time. The Regent arrived then, his throne ship blooming from a fold in space like a dark flower. Its voice poured across every band and into every hull. A velvet weight that tried to make spines. Bend, he told Saren that he had guarded her ancestors once and that he had chosen control after losing too many worlds to the chaos of free will. He said he could restore her home if she gave him the child, and delivered the human ship as tribute. Saren stood at the forward glass, her face steady the shard, a small sun in her palm, and said, "Hope is not a trade. It is a gift we pass along." The Regent smiled in a way that felt like winter pretending to be spring, and the throne ship opened a maw, and gathered a beam of night thicker than mountains. Rhea saw the aim not at the Starborn but past it, along a long equation that ended at Haven Spire, the place where their oath had become a public light. She understood at once the cruelty of it, the desire to break the idea of humans more than their ship. She ordered a hard turn to intercept and told the Coalition to finish the collapse and hold the core while they drew the spear. The beam began to fire and the Starborn climbed into its path, not fast enough to stop all of it, but fast enough to turn enough of it aside that the difference would be the difference between a city gone and a city wounded. Jax poured every last reserve into the shield and laughed ragged and real because laughter sometimes is a bridge you run across when the ground behind you is falling. Saren took Elian's hand and counted breaths, not for the lock this time, but for courage. 1 for the dead, 2 for the living, 3 for those still waiting, and the ship met the lance with a white scream of metal and light. The Coalition outside the jaw held the line, and the core shook and the rings slowed again. The Regent watched with eyes that held no pity, and the Ghost Admiral turned his ship half a degree as if to bow to an opponent who had chosen the harder road. The moment hung like a bell that had just been struck, and the sound of it rolled outward toward every free world that still listened as the path to the end opened and demanded an answer. The beam struck and the Starborn screamed through every rib of metal, yet it held, and Rhea felt the vibration of survival travel from the hull into her bones. The lance split in 2 streams, one grazing the moon of Haven Spire, one bending away into the dark, and the city beneath the glass dome stayed alive. The shield shattered, but it had done its work. The crew was thrown to the deck, Jax coughing smoke and laughter together, Saren clutching Elian with hands shaking from light burn, Mara shouting status over alarms. Rhea stood through the storm, her face bright with the glow of the dying beam. She looked through the viewport and saw the forge collapsing in waves of red shadow rings cracking into dust while the Coalition's ships fired everything they had into the wound to make sure it would not heal. The Ghost Admiral's fleet hung motionless in the dying light. His ships watched as the hollow sun folded inward into a black sphere and then vanished, leaving only a scar of dim starlight in its place. His voice came over the channel, faint, cracked by interference and emotion. He said it was over, that his models had failed to predict mercy, and that mercy had won. He said he would withdraw to face the judgment of his own kind, and Rhea answered that judgment without mercy is only revenge. The channel went silent and the Admiral turned his ships away from the wreck of his empire. The Regent's throne ship tried to flee using a gravity fold, but the collapsing forge dragged at it, pulling shards of its hull in glowing arcs. The voice of the Regent filled every channel, pleading for his machines to obey, and then promising the stars would still remember him. Saren stood near the console and raised the shard. "It's light now, white as dawn," she said. "The stars remember everyone, even those who tried to own them." The light leapt from her hand and connected with the Regent's ship in a bridge of color. The throne split open, the light pouring through its seams, and when it went dark, there was no explosion, only stillness like a storm deciding to sleep. Silence filled the comm lines, broken only by breathing and the soft crackle of static. The Coalition counted the living one ship at a time. Every name called, back an echo that became a chorus of the surviving. The miners battered and blackened, their hulls melted but intact. The synthetics singing faintly through damaged transmitters, their notes now a lullaby instead of a weapon. The monks on Pelagos, sending word that Haven still stood, and that the aurora over the sea had changed color from green to gold. Inside the Starborn, the lights dimmed to a warm glow. Rhea leaned against the command chair, her uniform torn, her hair loose and wild. Saren helped Jax reset the main breakers, while Elian lay wrapped in a thermal blanket, his small hands clutching a med pack. He smiled when Rhea knelt beside him and said the darkness was gone. She told him the darkness never really goes. It just learns to wait, and that is why people have to keep lighting fires. Jax laughed at that and said the ship could still fly if nobody sneezed too hard. Mara came in from the comm bay and said transmissions from 20 sectors were calling them heroes. Rhea looked at her and said, "Heroes are stories told after the fire cools. We are just the ones still warm enough to move." Saren walked to the viewport. The stars outside looked new, somehow cleaner, as if the galaxy itself had taken a breath. She opened the shard one last time, and its light formed a signal that streamed outward through every frequency. A simple tone carrying 3 sentences. "We showed up for you. We will show up again. You are not alone." The words bounced across networks and beacons, and broken satellites until even the most remote colonies heard them. Ships in hiding turned on their lights and drifted together, forming constellations that looked like hope drawn in motion. Later, they returned to Haven Spire. The docking bay filled. With people waving banners and lights, the air tasted of metal and sweet smoke from the celebration fires. Rhea stepped out first, and the crowd went silent as she raised a hand. She told them this victory belonged to everyone who refused to stay. Afraid, she said the pale crown fell not because of weapons, but because of choice. Saren stood beside her. The shard dimmed now. Like a memory, Elian climbed onto a crate and waved shyly, and the crowd roared his name. The monks sent blessings from Pelagos. Through open channels, miners sent laughter, synthetics sent music, and the galaxy's night began to sound alive again. When the celebration ended, Rhea walked alone to the top of the spire where the wind touched her face. She looked at the stars and saw ships moving between them, not in fear but in promise. She whispered that the dead were not gone. They were constellations now lighting the path for those who came next. She felt the Starborn humming in her mind, even docked. The ship wanted to move, and she smiled at that because so did she. Down in the hangar, Saren packed the shard into a containment cradle to keep it as a reminder. Not a weapon. Jax and Mara argued about which part of the hull to rebuild first. Elian ran circles around them with a model ship in his hands, shouting orders and laughter echoing off the walls. It was not peace exactly, but it was something close enough to make people breathe easier. The next morning, Rhea stood on the bridge again, the sunlight from the nearby star flooding through the glass. She placed her hand on the control sphere and said, "One more run." Saren nodded and said there were whispers from the edge worlds of more survivors waiting, of new alliances forming. Rhea smiled and said, "Then, we better go before hope gets lonely." The Starborn lifted from the dock, engines flaring soft gold, turning toward the open black. Across the galaxy, the signal continued to travel, touching worlds that had forgotten light. Every species that heard it spoke the same phrase. Humans showed up, and the universe felt a little less empty. Rhea watched the stars stretch ahead and thought that maybe that was enough. Maybe that was what the word Starborn meant. Not born from stars, but born for them, a promise to keep showing up until the darkness ran out of names. And so the story closed not in silence but in motion. The Starborn flying through the endless night, carrying laughter scars and a single vow that had outlived empires to be the fire that answers when the galaxy calls. The sky was quiet when the new dawn rose over Haven Spire. The war had ended, but the stars still carried. The echo of what had been Rhea Vale stood on the balcony of the command tower, watching the sunlight crawl across the battered hulls in the harbor. Every ship that remained had its own story written in scorch marks and weld lines. The air smelled of ozone and salt, the scent of life continuing after everything should have stopped below her. The people of many worlds gathered in the open square. Humans, aliens, miners, monks, synthetics, and children, all standing together without borders between them. They had built fires, the kind that spoke of survival, not mourning. and the light from those flames rose to the sky like a slow prayer. Siren came beside her holding the crystal shard, its glow now, a soft ember instead of the fierce light that had once burned through it. She said the shard was no longer a weapon. It was a memory of what unity felt like. She told Rhea that her mother's echo had been right. A vessel does not carry the ocean. It learns to move with the wave. Rhea smiled and said that was all they ever did. They learned to move with what came until movement itself became a kind of faith. Elian ran past them, chasing a small drone that Jax had built from broken sensors, his laughter ringing in the air like a promise too pure for any empire to silence. Mara leaned against the rail nearby, watching the crowd, and said they had no fleet, no banner, no command, but somehow the galaxy had begun to listen to them anyway. Ghost Admiral had kept his word. His fleet had vanished beyond the outer rim, and rumors said he was teaching his people what mercy looked like in the ruins of their empire. The Pale Crown no longer ruled, only fragments of their machines. Drifted, between systems like ghosts of a past that refused to haunt Siren, had become the voice for the coalition speaking across worlds, teaching that courage was not fury but care, that to show up for one another was the only way any world could remain. Free the monks of Pelagos had sent songs that now played through Haven's open halls. The synthetics repaired cities, the miners built homes, and every child who looked up at night saw stars unchained. Rhea walked through the markets where traders called her captain. Even when she wore no uniform, she stopped at a stall and bought a small metal compass. Its needle always pointed not north but home. She placed it in her pocket and said, "Maybe that is what humanity gives to the stars, a way to find home even when there is none left to return to." Siren said home is any place where people choose to keep the light alive, and Rhea said then home is wherever the Starborn flies. That night, when Haven's lights dimmed, Rhea stood on the deck of her ship again, the Starborn repaired and ready. The crew assembled one more time, Jax in the engine pit, Mara with her data slates, Siren at the glass. With Ilian beside her, the stars above were wide and calm. Rhea placed her hand on the control sphere and felt the pulse of the reactor beneath her like a living heart. She spoke to the crew and said, "We are not running anymore, and we are not fighting anymore. We are just going, because there are still voices out there waiting to know that they are not alone." The engines flared with a gold light and the Starborn lifted slowly through the thin mist above the spire. The people below watched as the ship rose higher until it became only a bright line against the blue. The last sound that reached the city was the soft hum of its drive. The sound of a promise being kept, and somewhere far ahead in the dark between stars that promise became a signal. The same 3 words carried through every shadow we showed up. In the silence that followed, the galaxy turned and healed a little. The darkness learned to fear light again, and the legend of the humans who showed up kept growing, told and retold, until it became more than history. It became hope. And whenever someone saw a golden flare cutting across the night, they whispered the name of the ship that had refused to fall, Starborn the End.